Good afternoon. We'd like to call the Rules Committee meeting to order. Do I have a motion to accept the minutes from the last meeting?
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye. Opposed, like sign. Thank you. We have two items before us this afternoon. The first item is an ordinance amending and or supplementing Title 3, Chapter 38, Unlawful Discrimination of the Code of Ordinances of the City of Akron and declaring an emergency. I beg your pardon.
Thank you, Chairman Freeman, members of the committee. Since both the ordinances before you today have to deal with the Akron Civil Rights Commission, to kind of start us off, with your permission, I'd like to introduce the chair, the current chair of the Akron Civil Rights Commission, Brant Lee, who would like to give you guys just a little bit of an introduction and a brief overview of the commission and what they've been doing to date.
Welcome, Mr. Lee.
I guess I turn this on. Hi, it's a privilege and an honor to be able to address you. Just to refresh your recollection, the Akron Civil Rights Commission was created by municipal ordinance in March of 2017, so it's coming up on 3 years, and we thought it would be a good time to bring you an update. The initial set of commissioners was appointed in June of that year, and we met for the first time in October. Although we have no particular budget or dedicated staff, we've been supported by the mayor's office and by, especially by the law department. So just to introduce you, the commission's primary task is to receive, investigate, and resolve discrimination complaints. And so when we met, our first order of business was to actually create a set of rules and regulations and procedures to govern how we would organize ourselves and how we would handle complaints. And so with the help of the law department, with some law students from the University of Akron volunteered, and also a young attorney at the law department who's now your colleague representing Ward 8. We developed and adopted those rules in January of 2018, right? So we've already gone a fair amount of way just getting our house in order. We developed the complaint form. To date, we have received 19 complaints. We realized that we needed training. The commissioners themselves needed training with respect to discrimination law. And because our procedures require individual commissioners to carry out investigations and also to facilitate the conciliation of any complaints, we realized that we had to train ourselves. So we received some help from actually from staff at the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. The regional director, Bradley Dunn, who was able to give us some background on the way that they carry out investigations, the way that complaints can be conciliated, and the different kinds of procedural requirements that we had to pay attention to. Of those 19 complaints, the majority of them, about 2/3 of them, were dismissed because they were not within our jurisdiction for some reason. Either they were complaints against an entity that we don't cover. For instance, our ordinance doesn't allow us to receive complaints against government entities. Also, if they took place outside of the borders of the city of Akron, that's not something that we can, those aren't the kinds of complaints that we can hear. So complaints come in of all different kinds. People don't always know exactly what it is that we cover. So as it turns out, a fair number of the complaints that we've received, we've determined with help from the law department that they're not complaints that we can consider. About 7 of those complaints have gone forward to investigation. 1 complaint has gone forward with a finding that there was a reasonable cause of discrimination, and that complaint has now been set for what would be our first hearing, which will be later this year. Otherwise, there are 2 investigations that are ongoing, and that's the status of the complaints. I want to point out that we actually have another charge other than handling the discrimination complaints, which is that the commission take seriously our duty to provide some education in collaboration with other entities or possibly with council members so that the broader public can actually know what we do. I'll be honest, we wanted to pace that carefully because at the outset we weren't prepared to handle a whole lot of complaints, and so we didn't necessarily want to invite a lot of business that we couldn't handle. But we're up and running. We're grateful that there will be some additional commissioners being added to our number. We're actually running a little bit short right now. Part of our procedure is that an individual commissioner who investigates and another individual commissioner who might be involved in conciliating a claim are then ineligible to hear that complaint, right? So that actually leaves us shorthanded, especially when our numbers are low. Right now we have 4 members of the commission, and if 2 of them are ineligible to hear the complaint, we are supposed to be hearing them as a 3-person panel. So a new commissioner is going to come just in time for us to be able to administer our first hearing later this year. The final thing I want to add is with respect to that education mission, we undertook to seek out some support for that. Actually, I'd like to point out that 2 of the other commissioners are here, Cindy Christman and Gina K. Maddox. And Gina Kay is the vice chair of the commission, and Ms. Christman is the secretary. And particularly, Ms. Christman undertook to apply for a grant and received a grant from Triad Communications, which is a local public relations company and graphic design company, who helped us design a brochure and a poster, and with the city's help, we've been able to arrange to have those printed. So we're actually now kind of finally prepared to sort of engage more in with some literature to be able to hand out. We have attended a few ward meetings, and so there have been some ad hoc education efforts so far. But with that, I'm happy to stay and answer any questions if you'd like.
Questions or comments will begin with committee members. Ms. Amobian.
Thank you so very much for your work. It sounds like you're doing probably more than you bargained for. Let me ask you this. I don't know this, but how are these commissions normally staffed? Is there a way that they are staffed across the state or whatever? Because it sounds like, I mean, you repeated several times that you don't have the labor to help with a lot of things. And it sounds like you only, based on this, if I read it correctly, you get paid when you meet. But if you do work outside of the meetings, that's nothing that you're reimbursed for. Is that correct?
So that's right. Under the ordinance, we get $100 per meeting.
Right.
And I'm glad you brought that up. One of our investigators sort of kept track of the hours that they spend on an investigation, and she spent 13 hours on the investigation, and there isn't anything in the ordinance that compensates for that. We haven't yet gone through a conciliation, actually we did a conciliation. We have not yet gone through the full hearing process. So any preparation time, rather than say it's uncompensated, I guess I would say it's wrapped up in that $100. But certainly you can think for yourself how far that goes. When we first did a little bit of research to sort of see how we would set ourselves up, we found that other cities have all sorts of different arrangements. One that I remember in particular, I think it was Dayton, that already had a pre-existing human relations commission that had an executive director, right, that had staff, and then they rolled this duty into that pre-existing funded and staffed organization. So that's a little bit different than us. We kind of started from scratch.
Were you going to say something, Ella? I guess I'm just curious. I can see why you need additional members based on what you've shared. I'm just curious as to, are there resources to provide support staff of any kind to assist with this? I know we can get volunteer law students and all of that, but still, you're talking about a lot of work that we should be taking seriously, I hope, and it depends on the kind of time people have.
I think that's probably something that this council can look at during the budget process and look at, you know, the amount of work and the hours and whether or not that merits, you know, some sort of additional or dedicated staff member. I don't know that we have all that information right now, but we can obviously have a continuing conversation about that. I think the law department and the mayor's office definitely does their best to, you know, provide the commission with the support that we can, given our other duties, but sure. That's obviously a conversation we can continue to have during budget.
So it'd be helpful if you would keep track of the hours that you're spending on cases, particularly outside of the meetings.
Yes, we'll do that.
So we can figure out if there's something else we can do. Thank you very much for your service.
Mr. Malley?
I just want to thank the commission members and the others who have served on the commission, Mr. Lash and Ms. Connor, and the folks in the mayor's office and in the city law department who I've watched spend long hours trying to build something that we didn't previously have. But now here, because of you know, the leadership of Mayor Horgan, we have a venue by which people who might not be able to bring an Ohio Civil Rights Commission complaint because of gender identity discrimination or sexual orientation discrimination, or couldn't go to federal court, now have an opportunity to be heard. And so I just want to thank you all for your work on that.
Of course, as we continue to have elections, you continue to lose board members. Mr. Fusco.
Thank you for all your hard work. Certainly appreciate it. And I know Mr. Lash was also a member too, so you've, maybe you need more alternates. I don't know if any of these are going to be considered alternates or not, or is that going to change the composition of the actual commission? Or
so that's actually the first piece before you, so that's a good segue into that. So as initially constituted, the commission was 5 full members and then 2 alternates. And again, having built this sort of from scratch, as we went through the process and started having commission meetings, we found that there really was not a functional difference between the contributions that members made and alternates made. And we felt that it made most sense going forward just to have all 7 of those spots be full members. So that's the first piece before you, which requires a change in the code to encompass that. So that's the answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and entering into discussion referenced more support. This is timely as budget time is upon us very soon in terms of the operating budget itself. And I know there's other commissions and committees and so on and so forth that we have, and there's varying degrees of how much time is spent and so on and so forth. And so, but for the most part, everyone is voluntary, or like you said, $100 really doesn't cover, I'm sure, that effort and time, and that's why, you know, we all appreciate everything that's done throughout the city and what you're dealing with as well. Appreciate your expertise on that. Thank you.
Mr. Swirsky? Let me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Any other committee members, questions or comments?
I've already asked the question. I do have another one.
Okay.
I would just like to say that thank you for all your work. It was a pleasure to serve, even if it was for a brief time. I learned a valuable wealth of information, and I look forward to supporting you in any way I can, not only with additional commission members that are fully vested, but for support with your public education, which I think is really a huge piece of this process.
Thank you. Do you have another comment, Ms. Moe?
Just a quick question. You mentioned something about a case that was related governmentally that you could not hear. Could you give an example of what you're talking about?
Oh, I'm trying to remember the particulars. I think one of them involved the recreation department at Balch Street,
Okay.
which the complaint would have been against the community center, and we are under the ordinance, actually as amended, any political subdivision of the state, claims against a subdivision of the state are outside of our jurisdiction.
So Balt Street, help me understand, don't we own that?
Yes. So so that's the issue. That I think the idea of the ordinance of excluding that was that it would put the city, and kind of, since we are also an arm of the city, would put us in the position of sort of hearing a claim against ourselves. Although there are different ways that other places have resolved that, in our ordinance, that was decided that we would just not be able to hear those complaints.
Okay.
So I think in those instances also, if I could add to that, there have been a couple that fell under those exceptions. I think the Akron Public Schools are another exception. Those individuals are connected with resources so they can potentially look to file with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission or another venue. So they're not excluded from having their complaint heard, just not by this body.
Thank you.
Mr. Swirsky.
I was one of the original co-sponsors of this. I'm really, really pleased with how well it's worked out, how professional and how intelligently you guys have gone about your business on this issue. And I just want to thank you, as well as the other council people who supported this, but I want to thank the commission members for your service. And I really recognize the mayor's office in the leadership they played on this, not only in introducing it, but also in supporting it as much as they can. I think that's really important. We have a lot of commissions in the city, and I think you guys are really helping this cutting-edge project here. You're helping nurture it, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
If I could say one last thing, with respect to that education mission, we haven't really had time to pay that much attention to it, but it has occurred to us as there are various kinds of tensions in the city, that the Civil Rights Commission could function as something of a third party, right? A kind of a neutral mediator in various with regard to various issues or as they arise in the city. That would all, we would see that as all falling under that education function, but as we've said, we haven't yet had time to fully focus on that.
You said you have been out to a couple ward meetings, council people?
I think some individual members of the commission have been to ward meetings. Yeah.
Very good. Mr. Swirsky?
Yeah, she's been to my ward meeting, and she did a great job. Could you stand up? And just want to thank her, and it really is a good subject for a ward meeting discussion. In the brochure that they've printed and developed is also very good quality. And any ways that you can share those brochures, I share them with my students, and everybody really is encouraged, especially people who maybe are a little bit different, or whether they're an immigrant or someone who doesn't have a job or someone who's of a different sexual orientation. Just seeing the brochures empowers and provides support for people who sometimes are disenfranchised.
So, unto the least of these is what comes to my mind when I think about your work. So thank you for what you're doing. And what would be, consent be okay on this? Or should we go with emergency measure?
I think given the pending hearing, if it's the will of this committee, we would appreciate a passage tonight, given that we do not have a council meeting next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye for suspension of the rules. Opposed? Okay, thank you. Next, we have a resolution approving and confirming the appointment by Mayor Horrigan of Esther Thomas, LaTonda Belcher, and Nancy Holland as members of the Akron Civil Rights Commission and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Chairman. So, given the recommendation on the previous piece, this would be for 3 new full commission members, replacing the individuals who've left us recently, including Sharon and Francia. And one of those appointees is here in the audience. Esther Thomas is present. Some of you may know her, but I'm sure she'd be willing to speak with any of you afterwards as well to introduce herself. And these three individuals, I think, will provide excellent community background. They have professional experiences that will serve them very well on this commission. Another thing we've learned from the time we've been here is that skill in mediation and conciliation and being able to weigh, different sides and bring people together is very useful. I think all three of these candidates bring that to the table. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know you guys received copies of each of their resumes.
Does this bring us up to the 7?
Correct. So this will be fully staffed or fully, full membership for the commission.
Questions or comments? Oh, Russ, I'm sorry. Councilman Neal?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. My questions are kind of general, not in relation to those, so I can wait till afterwards if you'd like.
Maybe if you'd want to even.
Okay.
However you'd like to answer.
Just want to be reminded, I know, Mr. Lee, you and I have had some conversations. What are the main cases held by the Civil Rights Commission?
What are the main
Yeah.
individual cases, or you're talking generally
Just
about?
in general, not a specific case, because I remember at first, when it first came in, I know it had something to do with housing, but
So there's 3 areas of discrimination that are covered: employment, housing, and public accommodations. Public accommodations is a pretty big catch-all for places that are open to the public generally. And then there are all the categories on which you can't discriminate, which there's a broad variety, but they include race, sex, sexual orientation, religion.
because this is what's coming to mind. One, when you talked about the case overload, I was wondering how much collaboration between like Fair Housing Contact Service and what's the other one's name?
So
Those organizations, and then also just well, like an ACP comes to mind. Folks that should know what you do so that they can sort of like leverage and support what you do. But then I'm also thinking from the standpoint more so of educating us here within city government, because I don't know if you guys deal with it even because it's a form of, it translates to discrimination when we have the discussion about the inequities and the report that came out. We've had discussions here about how do we make sure that our policies, I know you guys wouldn't hear that, but when you talk about employment, one of the challenges that we have is even some of our employment practices here in the city. So I know you can't touch those because it's with the city. So I'm trying to see how can we leverage the work that you're doing, not just here in government, but with supporting groups, because I'm hoping that you guys would deal with some of those cases.
So let me just say 2 things in response to that. One of them is that with regard to working with other organizations, that has taken place a little bit, I think, informally, to the extent that some of those organizations are aware that we exist and know about us. They can refer people to us, right? They can say, oh, you could file a complaint with them. I know that Fair Housing Contact Service in particular has held some panel discussions in which they've included sort of information and education about the commission. So that has happened, on a kind of an ad hoc basis. The other thing you're talking about is a little bit what I was trying to address with regard to a broader education function. When you look at civil rights commissions, other civil rights commissions, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, one of their functions is not just to hear complaints, but to perhaps investigate and then issue reports, right, about the state of discrimination with regard to a particular group or a particular industry. That kind of activity has been something that we have sometimes thought we might undertake. Sometimes a Civil Rights Commission can hold public hearings to bring attention to a particular issue, but it hasn't been anything that we've so far felt like we've had the time and resources to focus on.
Any other questions or comments regarding the legislation? Would you like to introduce anyone that, is Ms. Thomas I've not got to meet anyone, but if you'd like to introduce her, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I can do that. Do you want to step up to the podium and just provide a few words?
Greetings and salutations, council members. My name is Attorney Esther Thomas. I'm a native Akronite. I grew up in Goodyear Heights. I was a Head Start student, graduated of that program as well as Western Reserve Academy. I attended the University of Cincinnati Law School, and following law school, I had the privilege of working for all three branches of state government. And then I moved back to Akron to care for my mother, where I worked at juvenile court for 13 plus years. 7.5 of those years was as a magistrate hearing dependency, neglect, and abuse cases, as well as being the first magistrate to initiate the family reunification through recovery court, family drug court. So it is my honor and privilege to be considered for the commission, and I will endeavor to do my very best to serve this community.
Welcome. Thank you very much for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just one last thing before you guys vote. I did want to recognize Phil Young, who I'm sure you all know as our independent police auditor, is here because he has also been providing some ancillary support for the commission in terms of just being a first point of contact for complainants and being someone who they can speak with and kind of just get the basis of their complaint heard without maybe even filing a formal complaint. He's been very helpful, and I just wanted to recognize Phil here as well.
And Phil Young, I'm sure he offers the support of all his people on his staff, too. All right. Thank you so much for all that you do, and what would be the pleasure in this?
Same, I would request
Okay.
immediate passage if possible, yes.
We have a motion for suspension of the rules, favorable report. All in favor, let it be known by saying aye. Opposed? All right, we'll pass that out this evening. Thank you so very, very much for being with us today. Thanks to each and every one of you, and we will adjourn at 2:57.